The prairie wind didn't care about wedding bells. It blew through the hills that morning like a warning, dry, restless, cutting through silk and lace just as easily as it did dust and bone. Clara May Whitmore stood at the top of the ranch steps, her veil pinned tightly to her blonde hair, the hem of her dress already catching dirt from the path below. Her fingers trembled against the bouquet someone had shoved into her hands. She didn't feel like a bride. Because she wasn't. Not truly. Inside, behind the heavy oak doors of the Whitmore estate, lay her groom, Elias Tulliver, the most powerful cattle baron in the territory. Unconscious, silent, 3 weeks into a coma brought on by a riding accident no one could quite explain. And yet today she was marrying him. Just sign, Clara, her uncle pressed, his voice low and urgent beside her. He has no heir. If the marriage is official, you'll inherit the land if he doesn't wake. Otherwise, it'll go to the banks. You want to lose this ranch, too? She didn't answer. Her heart had already lost too much. Her mother, buried last spring. Her father, run off or dead. No one knew for sure. And now she stood in a borrowed dress, being wed to a man who couldn't even say her name. The parlor was too quiet, the air too thick. Beside the bed, Elias looked peaceful, his dark hair combed neatly, his skin pale but unbroken. He'd been tall once, strong, feared across the plains for how he ran cattle and crushed competitors alike. But now he was just a man on a bed. And Clara, barely 19, soft-spoken, too smart for her own good, was about to become Mrs. Tulliver. The preacher cleared his throat. "Do you, Clara May Whitmore, take this man, Elias James Tulliver?" The words blurred. Her lips moved. She said them. And when the pen was placed in her hand, she signed. The paper fluttered in her grip. The room was still. That night, as the wind beat against the windows and the ranch hands drank quietly in the stables to celebrate a marriage no one dared toast aloud, Clara sat beside her sleeping husband. "You can't hear me," she whispered. "And maybe that's for the best." She reached for the ledger on the desk, the one with land titles, livestock records, bank threats hidden between names and numbers. "I didn't marry you for love. I married you for survival. And maybe one day I'll forgive myself for it." She stood to leave, then froze, because Elias's hand moved. Just a twitch, just enough. But it moved. Clara stood frozen in the dim light of the room, her breath caught in her throat. She stared at Elias's hand. It hadn't been a breeze. It hadn't been her imagination. It had moved. Just a flick of the fingers, a shift of muscle under skin. But after weeks of stillness, of breath machines and whispered prayers and legal documents forged in desperation, it was enough to unravel her certainty. She leaned in slowly, heart pounding. "Elias?" Silence. His face remained unchanged, pale, resting, as though nothing had happened. She stayed by the bedside well past midnight, her fingers hovering over his, waiting. Nothing more. No twitch, no stir, no sign. But something had changed. Not in him, in her. The next morning, Uncle Raymond entered the room with 2 men from town. Bankers, curious and quick-eyed. "Heard the marriage went through," one of them said, barely looking at Clara. "Quite the arrangement." Clara's voice was cool. "It's legal." "Maybe," the other said with a smirk. "But without a conscious groom, the court might ask questions about intent, especially if he doesn't recover." Clara's jaw tightened. "He will." Raymond shot her a warning glance. "She's tired, still adjusting." "I'm not tired," Clara replied. "I'm watching closely." That afternoon she returned to Elias's bedside. This time she brought a book, an old volume of poetry she'd once loved as a girl. She read aloud, unsure why, her voice low but steady. Nothing happened, but she kept coming back. 3 days passed. Then, as she was refilling a water basin near the window, she heard it. A groan, barely audible, like a man at the edge of a dream he didn't want. She rushed to the bed. Elias's brow twitched. His lips parted. And in a voice like gravel and drought, he whispered, "Where?" Clara leaned closer, heart racing. His eyes blinked open, unfocused, clouded, but open. "Elias," she breathed, "you're awake." He stared at her, frowned. "Who are you?" Outside the room, the wind howled across the ranch. Inside, Clara's world tilted. Because the man she'd married in desperation, the man who'd ruled this land with quiet fury, no longer remembered her face. And maybe that would be the beginning of everything. Elias Tulliver had the sharp gaze of a man used to command, but now that gaze was lost, floating somewhere behind confusion, shadows, and pain. He blinked at Clara like she was a mirage, a name he should know but couldn't grasp. "You're in your home," Clara said softly. "You've been unconscious for weeks." Elias tried to sit up, groaned, fell back against the pillows. "What happened?" "You had a fall," she said. "A riding accident. You've been in a coma. He winced. And who are you? She hesitated. I'm Clara Whitmore. Still no recognition. She took a deep breath. I'm your wife. The silence after that was the kind that pulled oxygen from a room. Elias stared at her hand, the gold band glinting on her finger. My wife? Clara nodded, slowly, carefully. We married while you were asleep. It was urgent. The ranch needed protection. His jaw clenched faintly. Who arranged it? Your attorney, my uncle. They said you had no heir, that if you didn't wake, the banks would take everything. I didn't agree to this. Clara flinched at the truth in his voice. No, she said quietly. You didn't. Outside, ranch hands moved as usual. The cattle moaned, dust rose from dry paths, but inside the dynamic had shifted. The man who had once ruled this land without question had awakened to a world where a stranger wore his name and his ring, and the woman who had once felt powerless now carried the weight of choices she never wanted to make. That night, Elias didn't eat much. He asked questions, though, about the ranch, the accounts, the cattle. Clara answered what she could, avoided what she couldn't. He watched her carefully, eyes narrow, trying to piece her together. You don't talk like someone who married for love, he said. Clara looked down. I didn't. He nodded once. At least you're honest. Later, after he'd fallen back into sleep, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The wind had stilled. The stars were sharp above. She touched the ring on her finger. He's awake, she whispered to the night. But I don't know who I've married. She didn't realize someone was listening from the corner of the porch. Raymond, and the look on his face wasn't relief. It was calculation, because if Elias truly regained himself, everything Raymond planned could collapse. The morning after Elias woke, Clara found him sitting up in bed, already dressed in a shirt someone must have laid out the night before. How did you... I'm not as weak as I look, he said, his voice rough but determined. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his body protesting every movement, but his willpower overriding it. Clara hurried to his side, instinctively placing a hand beneath his arm to steady him. He paused, looked down at her hand. You don't have to help me. I know, she said, but I will. Elias's recovery became the talk of the ranch. Whispers passed from hand to hand, some hopeful, some worried, some quiet with suspicion. The man had come back from the edge of death. But no one knew what that meant for the land, or for Clara, especially not Clara. Elias insisted on walking the perimeter of the ranch house by the end of the week. It was slow going. His limp was sharp, his strength limited, but he made the rounds, noting things. The broken fence post near the west paddock, the state of the grain storage, and the young ranch hand who froze when Elias caught his eye, then quickly turned away. Who's that boy? Elias asked, pointing subtly with his chin. Lyle, Clara said. New. Hired by my uncle after, during your coma. Elias's brow darkened. He doesn't look like a rancher. By midday, Elias was exhausted. Clara brought him tea on the porch and watched the sunset paint the prairie in gold and rust. I can't imagine what you must be thinking, she said, her voice low. He didn't answer right away. Just sipped the tea, eyes distant. I'm trying to remember, he said finally. Not just who you are, but who I was. You were respected, Clara said, and feared, and alone. He glanced at her. You married a sleeping man, Clara. I'm not sure what that says about you. She bit her lip. That I was desperate. He nodded, then added softly, or brave. Inside, Raymond watched from behind the curtain. Elias's strength was returning faster than expected. Too fast. And that meant Raymond's plan had a deadline. That night, Clara sat by Elias's bedside again. This time, not as a stranger. Not quite. He spoke first. Did you ever wonder what kind of man I might have been? If I hadn't lived like I had something to prove? She looked at him for a long moment. Yes. And for the first time since he'd opened his eyes, he smiled. But in the shadows of the house, a document was being forged. A will rewritten, a lie prepared, because Elias might be alive. But someone on that ranch didn't plan on letting him stay that way. Rain rolled in from the west that night, tapping gently against the windows of the ranch house. Thunder rumbled low like distant hooves in the dark. Clara sat beside the fireplace, the flames licking low as Elias rested upstairs. She should have gone to bed, but her thoughts were too loud. The more Elias spoke, the more she realized something. He wasn't the same man people had feared, and yet he wasn't someone she could fully trust, not yet. In a study no one used anymore, Raymond poured himself a drink and unrolled a thin sheet of parchment. The forged will had been prepared days ago, its ink now dry, its lies written in careful script. It named Raymond Whitmore as sole executor of the Tulliver estate, should Elias pass away without a legitimate heir, which, according to the forged version of events, he soon would. A signature remained, and Raymond had hired someone for that. Someone skilled at recreating Elias's hand. All he needed now was time, and silence, The next morning, Clara helped Elias down the stairs. He moved slower than before, but more steadily. Something in his eyes had hardened. Not cruel, just focused. "I want to see the cattle," he said. "You can't ride yet." "Then bring a wagon." She didn't argue. Not because she agreed, but because something in her had begun to believe in him. They rode out together, crossing the frost-touched pastures and golden hills. The cattle moved slowly in the distance, their silhouettes against the sky like something from an old painting. Elias breathed in the air deeply. "This is what I missed," he said. She looked at him. "Not the power? Not the land?" He shook his head. "Not the land, just the life." Later, on the way back, they passed the chapel where Clara had said her vows. Elias asked her to stop the wagon. They sat there a while, watching the wind sway the wildflowers around the gate. "You were brave to stand in there alone," he murmured. "Even braver to stay once I woke up." "I didn't stay for you," she whispered. "I stayed for what you built, for the people who depend on this ranch, for myself." Elias looked at her, not with judgment, but with quiet admiration. "Then maybe," he said, "you're exactly what this place needed." But back at the house, a courier was already on his way, carrying papers, orders, instructions forged in Raymond's name. And within those papers, hidden behind legal jargon and false claims, was a deadline. If Elias didn't contest the documents within 7 days, he would lose everything. The morning sun rose pale behind a curtain of storm clouds, casting a strange hush over the ranch. Even the animals seemed quieter, like the land itself sensed a reckoning on the horizon. Elias stood near the barn, cane in hand, squinting toward the distant ridgeline. "What do you see?" Clara asked as she approached with his coat. He shook his head. "Not what I see, what I feel. Something's off. This place, it doesn't breathe the way it used to." Clara handed him the coat, uneasy. "I think someone's trying to suffocate it." Back in town, the courthouse clerk broke the seal on a parcel delivered that morning. Inside were legal documents filed under Elias Tulliver's name, but not written by his hand. The new will, the property transfer, letters of medical declaration suggesting mental instability. Everything was official, stamped, sealed, filed. Unless contested, it would all take effect in 6 days. At the ranch, Clara and Elias spent the day reviewing old ledgers. She hadn't seen half these books before. Records Elias had personally kept. He pointed to names, receipts, sales made quietly during the drought, debts he'd forgiven, supplies he'd given away. "You weren't the tyrant people say," she said softly. "I was," he admitted, "but I was also tired of watching people starve." That evening, Clara checked the mail. Among the letters was one without a return address. Inside a single page, a warning. "They're rewriting your legacy. You have 6 days left." Clara's hands shook as she read it again. Her uncle's name wasn't on the letter, but the intent was clear. She rushed back to Elias, finding him beside the corral. "You need to go into town," she said. "Now, contest everything, legally." He frowned. "On what basis?" "On the basis that you're very much alive." Meanwhile, Raymond sat in the study, swirling his glass in silence. He'd heard from the courier. The papers were filed. Now all he needed to do was wait, and make sure Elias didn't reach that courthouse in time. The storm outside cracked like a warning shot. Raymond smiled. Let the wind blow. But the wind wasn't on his side. Because in the shadows of the barn, Lyle, the young ranch hand, had heard everything. And Lyle owed Clara his life. Rain lashed the windows that night, turning the ranch into a dark, moaning echo of its usual calm. The fire crackled in the parlor, but Clara couldn't find warmth. Elias sat with a map spread over the table. Roads, trails, backways. "I'll never make it to town in time," he muttered. "Not on foot, not in this weather." Clara placed a hand on the edge of the table. "Then we ride." "You've seen my leg." "Then I ride. You tell me what to say." He looked up at her. "You'd go alone?" She nodded. "For this ranch? For you? Yes." In the barn, young Lyle paced like a caged dog. The conversation he'd overheard kept replaying in his mind. He remembered the day Clara hired him. Fresh off a failed season working fence lines, debts chasing him from every corner of the county. She gave him work, no questions, just trust. Now she was in danger of losing everything, and he owed her more than silence. By dawn, the storm had lightened, but the air still hung heavy, like a loaded gun waiting to go off. Clara saddled a horse with urgency. Elias stood beside her, leaning on his cane. "You'll need this," he said, pressing a small tin badge into her palm. She looked at it. His old cattle brand inspector's badge. "It still means something in town," he said. "Use it." Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. A bond forged not by romance, not yet, but by shared survival. Miles away, Raymond rode into town on his own. He wanted to be there, present, when the clock ran out. He tipped his hat at the clerk. "I trust everything's in motion." Unless contested, it becomes binding tomorrow, the clerk said. Raymond smiled. And who would dare contest it? As Clara rode hard through muddy hills and pine-soaked trails, Lyle made a decision. He rode east, toward the Whitmore estate, not to fight, but to gather proof. He had worked long enough on this land to know where the skeletons were buried. And maybe, just maybe, Raymond had left one bone too many unhidden. That night, Elias waited by the window, watching thunderclouds fade to stars. He wasn't sure if Clara would make it, but something in his chest, something stubborn and hopeful, believed she would. For the first time in years, Elias Tulliver didn't feel alone. Clara's cloak was soaked through by the time she reached the main road into town. Mud splattered her boots, and every breath burned with cold air. But she didn't stop. Every hoofbeat felt like defiance. Every gust of wind whispered, "You're almost there." Meanwhile, Lyle reached a secluded cabin behind the Whitmore property, an old storehouse Raymond once used during the war. It had been long forgotten, except by those who'd stacked crates and oil drums there by hand. He searched by lamplight, fingers numbed with cold. Behind a rotting cabinet, he found it. A locked chest marked with the Tulliver seal. Inside, financial records, stamped letters, copies of documents, and a journal. A journal in Raymond's handwriting. Back at the courthouse, the town clerk was tidying his desk for the night. The filing for Elias's estate would be finalized by sundown tomorrow. But just as he reached for the lantern to snuff it out, the door burst open. Clara stepped inside, face wind-chapped, eyes blazing. "I'm here to contest the claim on Elias Tulliver's estate." The clerk blinked. "Ma'am, you're—" She held up the old inspector's badge. "I have his authority, and I have truth." That same night, Raymond hosted a dinner. He toasted with his business partners, talked of futures, expansion, railroads. "By tomorrow," he said, "we'll begin moving in on the southern pasture. The deed will be in my name." But just as the glasses clinked, a knock came. Lyle stood in the doorway, hat in hand, boots dirty. "I think you lost something," he said. He held up the journal. Raymond's smile faltered. At the ranch, Elias sat quietly on the porch. The night was calm now, moonlight spilling across the fields. He watched the gate, waiting for a shadow, a sound, anything. And then far down the trail he saw it, a lantern, a horse. And Clara. She slid off the saddle, legs trembling, and walked straight into his arms. "It's not over yet," she whispered. "But it's not lost either." Elias closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, hope tasted real. Morning in Silverpine was unusually tense. Word spread quickly. Elias Tulliver's niece had contested the will. The townsfolk buzzed like bees stirred from sleep. Some were curious, others doubtful. A few feared what it might mean for their land dealings with Raymond Whitmore. But at the center of it all, Clara stood tall at the courthouse steps, holding papers, ledgers, and a journal full of secrets. Inside, the courtroom was modest, with wooden benches and the smell of old pine. Elias sat near the back, cane across his lap, eyes proud but distant. Clara stood before the judge. "I speak on behalf of my uncle, Elias Tulliver, alive, of sound mind, present in this room." Gasps filled the chamber. Raymond entered just then, expression perfectly neutral. Too perfect. "I object," he said. "This is nothing more than an emotional play. The man can barely walk, let alone manage a property of that size." Elias stood, maybe not with legs, but with memory, with heart, with what you never had, Raymond. Integrity. Clara laid out the evidence. Documents with forged signatures. Letters requesting Elias be declared unfit, filed while he was bedridden. A chain of paper that pointed directly to Raymond. And then, the journal. She read excerpts aloud, entries Raymond had written during his plan to slowly overtake the ranch, including this. "They think the old man won't notice. But he notices. I need this land, even if it means pushing him into the grave one whisper at a time." The room fell silent. Outside a storm brewed again, but this time not from the sky. It was the brewing of justice. Lyle stood by the door, nodding at Clara. Townsfolk looked at Raymond with new eyes. Even those who had once toasted with him now stepped back. The judge cleared his throat. "There's enough here for a formal investigation. Until then, all actions regarding the Tulliver estate are frozen." Raymond's jaw tightened. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath to Clara as he passed her by. Clara didn't flinch. "You're right. It's just beginning." That night, back at the ranch, Elias lit a cigar for the first time in years. Clara sat beside him on the porch. "You saved this place," he said. "I just did what needed doing," she replied. "No," he said, "you did what no one else dared." He placed the old inspector's badge in her palm again. "Keep it. You've earned it." In the days that followed, the Tulliver Ranch became more than a disputed property. It became a symbol. Neighbors who had once kept their distance came to offer support. A few older ranch hands returned, offering to help fix the fences, clean the sheds, and bring the place back to life. Clara worked side by side with them, not just as Elias's niece, but as someone deeply rooted now in this land. Her hands were blistered, but her heart was steady. The ranch was breathing again. Lyle remained close, often riding out to check the north perimeter. Though quiet by nature, he had become a quiet wall of support. One evening, as they closed the gate together, he handed her a folded piece of paper. "It's from the county office. They're filing fraud charges against Whitmore." Clara looked at him. "You made this possible." Lyle shrugged. "You made me believe it was worth doing." Their eyes held a little longer than before. Something unspoken lived between them. Something not yet ready for words, but patiently growing. Meanwhile, Elias began taking short walks each morning with a cane in one hand and a mug of strong coffee in the other. He paused often, staring at the tree line, whispering names. His late wife, his father, the men he rode with long ago. "This land remembers," he said once to Clara. "It knows who tends it and who tries to take it." Clara nodded. "Then we'll keep reminding it who we are." In town, Raymond's empire began to crumble. Silent investors pulled out. His name no longer opened doors. It closed them. And though he tried to rally sympathy, even charm, it was clear. Silverpine had chosen a side. One crisp morning, Elias surprised everyone. He stood before the fireplace, buttoned his best jacket, and addressed Clara and Lyle. "I've decided to sign the ranch over. Not because I'm done, but because I see what's next." "To whom?" Clara asked softly. He smiled. "To both of you." They looked at each other, startled. "I've got one last harvest in me, but after that, this place deserves fresh hearts." That evening, Clara stood in the field, watching the sun dip behind the ridge. The air smelled of cedar and soil. Elias approached slowly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Do you regret coming here?" She shook her head. "No, I think I was meant to end up exactly here." He nodded. "Funny how a forced marriage, coma, and storm led to this." Clara chuckled, then turned serious. "You saved me from more than a bad future. You gave me a new one." Autumn settled over Silverpine with a slow, golden hush. The fields glowed amber. The cattle were calm, and the wind carried the faintest whisper of coming frost. At the Tulliver Ranch, change wasn't just a season. It was a heartbeat. Fences had been repaired. Barn doors no longer creaked. And laughter, real steady laughter, had returned to the porch. Clara found herself smiling more, sleeping deeper, breathing easier. She had traded fear for purpose, loneliness for land, and most of all, survival for something that looked a lot like love. Lyle had become her quiet constant. He didn't try to fill every silence, he just stood beside her, strong, present. The kind of man who rode through storms not to be heroic, but because someone needed him. One evening he brought her a gift, a small leather-bound book. "What's this?" she asked. "My mother's seed journal. She used to say love and crops need the same things, care, time, and light." Clara ran her hand over the worn cover. "Then let's plant something honest." Their hands touched. Neither pulled away. Meanwhile, the town officially revoked Raymond's development rights. The charges had stuck. Fraud, coercion, medical manipulation. He left Silverpine quietly. No one mourned the absence. The Whitmore name would remain, on a street, maybe a ledger, but its grip had broken. In his place, a new story bloomed. On a soft Sunday morning, Elias took Clara and Lyle to the old family chapel on the hill. He leaned on his cane, looked out at the vast ranch below, and said, "Everything this land has seen, wars, droughts, heartbreak, it still heals." Clara replied, "It teaches too." Elias nodded. "Then you're ready. It's yours now." Clara hesitated. "What if I fail?" Lyle stepped beside her. "Then we try again." Later that night, with stars spilling like lanterns across the sky, Clara stood barefoot on the porch. Lyle joined her, holding 2 mugs of hot cider. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "Doesn't matter," he said, "as long as we're riding into it together." She looked up at him, eyes full of something deeper than gratitude. And for the first time since arriving in Silverpine, Clara leaned in, not out of fear or need, but because her heart wanted to. Winter crept over Silverpine with snow as soft as whispered forgiveness. The ranch slowed. The cattle were brought close to the barns, the roads grew quiet, and the fire inside the Tulliver homestead rarely went out. Inside, Clara sat beside Elias, reading aloud from one of the ledgers they'd found, records from the ranch's earliest years. Her voice was steady, comforting, and familiar. "I never thought I'd live long enough to see this place come back to life," Elias said, eyes shining. "You didn't just live to see it," Clara replied. "You made it happen." He smiled. "You gave it a future." Out in the snow-covered fields, Lyle moved with easy rhythm. He fixed gates, shoveled snow, carried feed, and always returned before sundown. boots heavy but spirit light. One evening, Clara waited on the porch as he came back from the western paddock. She held something in her hands. "My mother's locket," she said. "I found it in one of the old trunks upstairs." Lyle took it gently, studying the delicate metal. "She gave you strength, didn't she?" Clara nodded. "And a warning. Never trust a man who hides behind charm." Lyle looked at her, quiet. "And do you trust me?" "I do," she whispered. He stepped closer, brushing snow from her shoulder. Weeks passed. Then one morning, Elias didn't come down for coffee. They found him peacefully in his bed, a half-written letter beside him. It read simply, "To the ones who brought my home back to life, take it, build it, love it. I'll be watching from the hill. And Clara, thank you for staying, for fighting, for becoming more than anyone ever gave you credit for. You are Tulliver now." Elias, the funeral was quiet. No grand speeches, just stories shared around a bonfire and the sound of boots in snow. Later that night, Clara stood on the hill where Elias used to walk. Lyle joined her. "You okay?" She wiped a tear. "He was the first person to see all of me and not turn away." "You were never invisible," Lyle said gently. "The world just hadn't looked close enough yet." Spring came sooner than expected. The first buds appeared on the edge of the orchard. A new calf was born. And Clara, for the first time, began signing documents as Clara Tulliver. Together, she and Lyle rebuilt the ranch's branding station, the guest rooms, and the old seed garden. People came from town to help, to learn, to stay. The ranch was no longer just land. It was legacy. One afternoon, as Clara and Lyle stood side by side overlooking the valley, he reached into his coat pocket. A ring, simple, silver, weather-worn like them. "I don't have a speech," he said, "but I'd like to build the rest of this life with you." Clara didn't cry. She just nodded. And in that moment, under the endless western sky, two people who had lost everything found everything again, together.